We can look into the stiffener layouts a little bit. Now, we had talked about stiffener layouts before, and we're not using them in this model at the moment, but they can have some advantages both for refining the model as well as, during optimization, of course. That's, I guess, one of the main reasons for doing this. For optimization and things, having those stiffener layouts is a very convenient feature. So we'll go into properties here and see which layouts are available. And there was one that was created, the 2 internal stiffeners and 1 edge stiffener. So if we apply that to some of our strakes here, and we'll just do a couple samples on the top. We'll put on this inboard one, we will create that as our stiffener layout. And we'll turn on the stiffener display so we can see them. And I want to move to the beam 1 and also put stiffener layout there. Now, because of the taper on that forward beam, you can see our stiffeners getting closer and closer together as they reach the forward end. And to get to the definition of the stiffener layout, which is, we already have it open up here, but you can see typically whenever you select in one of these dialogues, whenever you're selecting a property, there's also an option here to just click on the layout, and it'll bring up the menu or the dialogue to edit that particular property. Unfortunately, there's 2 different options for editing the stiffener layout. This was the original menu, but there's a newer version that is integrated in with the properties dialog, which lists all of the existing ones down at the bottom. And I tend to stick with using this one. They will do the same thing. They're almost identical. This one just has the list in the bottom, so I kind of prefer it. But we're going to edit this stiffener layout. And while we're in here, this was another thing that came up the other day when we were creating some of the strakes. I think when we went to the stiffener layout tab, it was by default selecting ID number 1. And ID number 1 was not the null stiffener layout. So every strake we created wanted to have this flat bar 75 by 5, 2 internals and 1 on the edge. It wanted to use that layout, and we had to change it to turn it off because the default was going to come up as ID 1. Now, what we can do is reorder these. There's an up and down button in this dialog, so we can move that null property up to make it the first one. So even though it's still ID 3, it's now listed first. In order to enforce that, if we were to close this dialog, it would revert back to the original order. 3 is still at the bottom, for null stiffener layout. If I move it up and then hit modify, even though I didn't change anything other than the order, it'll ask, do you want to reorder the property list? And I can say yes. And now that null stiffener layout is ID 1, and it's going to be the default when I create any new strakes. That ability is kind of handy to clean up your model, or organize your model rather, especially for, well, if you have a lot of plates. If you created them out of order and you wanted to keep them in order by thickness, you can sort these anytime you want, just for viewing purposes. You can sort by name. You can sort by material. Any one of these columns will allow you to sort by thickness, and each time you click, it'll reverse the order, lowest to highest, highest to lowest. You can also go back to sorting by ID. But if you've changed the sort order in here, you can close the dialog and it doesn't change anything. But if you change that sort order in order to find the particular material you want so you can edit it, so I change this order, I go in and I edit and change the thickness or do some operation. If I hit modify to enforce that, it will make that change on the property, but then it'll also pop up the question, do you want to reorder the list? And even though you've accepted, it'll accept the change you've made to the property, you can still decline and say no to reordering the list, and it'll keep the original order. Because as I mentioned, like that model I'm working on has over 300 beams in it. So when I go in to find a beam that I need, and if I need to edit it, it's easiest for me to find it by, say, web height. And when you click on sort by web height, it will not only sort by this column, it'll do the web height smallest to largest. But if I have a lot of different beams that all have the same say 100 mm web height, then it will sort the next column lowest to highest for all of those values that are the same, and so forth. So it makes it very easy to find. There's also a feature in here where if you have duplicate beams, and this can be from, if you import another model into this one, there is an option that allows Maestro to just use existing properties, or it can bring in a second copy if you want. But if you wind up with multiple copies of the same beam, there's an option in here to consolidate, and it'll look through all of the existing beams, and when it finds identical beams, it'll combine them so that anything in the model that referenced either of those two beams will all reference just the new single version, just to sort of keep the model a little more organized as they get larger and larger. So yes, getting back to the stiffener layout. The other thing I wanted to do here was we can change the number of internal stiffeners. Let's because of this taper, they get a little tight. So instead of using a constant number of stiffeners, let's use a constant spacing, and we'll do 0.1 meters. That's a little tight, 0.15. As that taper comes inboard, it runs out of enough space at the tip of the beam. The width of that strake is only 0.125, and my stiffener spacing is 0.15. So I can't even fit a single stiffener in there. So it'll place the stiffener on those elements that are wide enough to accept it, and if there's not enough room, it'll stop. If I make this a bit smaller, and let's say we go with 0.75, 0.75, it'll fit one all the way to the end, two on these, and only one of them can accept three. So that can help with if you have a large change in the width of a strake. You may want to opt for breadth between stiffeners there. So if you have constant stiffeners, one of the other things you can do is there is an option to refine strakes. And I don't want to save this modification. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save a copy of my model right now. I'll just add a -1 to it so that I can just delete this and throw it away. But the refine quad/strake refinement button here will allow you to, if you have a stiffener layout defined, when you double click and refine it, it breaks it apart at each one of those stiffeners and creates a new strake, and it converts the internal stiffener to an explicit beam. Now, in the case of strakes, it uses the girder at the edge of the strake and converts it to a beam. And the internal stiffener layout for each one of those refined strakes is nothing. All of the internal stiffeners have now become explicit beams. Now, I had an edge stiffener defined in that layout, which is why it created one on the center line here, and it now overlaps with those plates and beams, so we'd have to fix that. But this also applies to quads. If I were to change this quad and add a stiffener layout to it, and we'll change the direction there. If I refine it, it'll become 3 quads with 3 additional beam elements there. Because that quad wasn't as uniform as the strakes were, you can see they don't go straight, they taper along, just as the layout did. But that can be a quick way to refine your model to get those explicit beams, and then you'll be able to edit them, and that's, I guess, what we were going to do next.